Welcome to the FAFSA Leadership Lounge, where we dive into the policies shaping the work of Florida's school leaders. I'm Michelle White, Executive Director of the Florida Association of School Administrators.
And I'm Jessica Janasiewicz, lobbyist for FAFSA and for several school districts across the state of Florida.
All right, Jess, so we're going to start today's episode with some big news. Last week, we had some special elections in the state of Florida to fill both House and Senate seats at the state level, and there were some big surprises.
Absolutely. There sure were, starting with Senate District 14, which was vacated due to former Senator Jay Collins when he was appointed to serve as lieutenant governor. So that opened up his seat, and it was in a surprising turn of events. The Democratic candidate Brian Nathan pulled off an upset against the Republican former Representative Josie Tomko, who our listeners may remember serving for a number of years in the House. And for some of those years, she was actually our education appropriations chairman. So someone who's pretty well known, and it was thought that, she was more than likely going to be successful. Certainly fundraising was much more in her favor than the Democrat. And so everyone thought that it would, maybe a tight race, but that she would pull it out.
Absolutely. And it was so close. They were separated by just 408 votes, which is just barely out of the range for a recount that would normally be needed if a race is too close to call. So he has definitely won that seat for now.
That's right. Sorry, that's exactly right. But it's interesting to note that just 2 years ago, when Senator Collins was running for that seat, he actually won the seat by 10 points. So, that was a presidential election. Obviously, things are different. Turnout's different at that time and everything. This is a special election. But I do think that is pretty telling. What's interesting, too, about this seat is that they will have to have another election in November. So this special just fills the time between now and the general election in November. So these candidates may meet again very soon. In fact, Representative Tomko, when she was speaking to her followers at the election party later that night, said, "Welcome to my campaign launch party." So she is ready to start running for that seat again.
That's right. So it is definitely a little, I'm going to say crazy, but it's Florida politics. At the end of the day, anything can happen. We'll definitely see what's going to happen over the next few months with that Senate district, but also House District 87. So the Democrat candidate also won there. Emily Gregory is a small business owner from the Palm Beach area, and she defeated John Maples, who is a financial advisor and a Republican.
Another pretty interesting thing about this race is that this is one where the president actually did get involved. President Trump endorsed Mr. Maples, and the district covers the area where Mar-a-Lago is located. But ultimately, Mrs. Gregory won the election with a little more than 51% of the vote. But that is pretty striking considering President Trump won the district just 2 years ago by about 9 percentage points. So that is pretty impressive.
It is. And to your point about the timing of these elections, right? The presidential election year is always the largest voter turnout. And even in like gubernatorial years, so like this year is going to be, that turnout usually is not as high as the presidential election years. And even primary and then special elections, we get even less. Another really big thing to kind of talk about through the elections process while we're still focused on statewide races is that FAFSA has a political action committee, separate organization, but what we do every year or every election year is interview candidates for statewide legislative races. And then the PAC makes, through our committee members that are participating, we make recommendations for contributions and endorsements to those candidates that align to FAFSA's values and views on education and those candidates that are likely to be successful. So over the last probably 2 to 3 election cycles, we definitely have a 90+% win rate, I would say, for the candidates that we work to support, and bipartisan certainly across the state as well.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And as a separate organization from FAFSA, administrators can participate in the full process from the election to making laws and participating in the legislative session. Each year we raise funds to contribute to candidates, and everyone's encouraged to make a donation. In fact, this year at our Discover 26 conference, we're going to have new big baskets that are filled with prizes, and winners will be drawn at the conference. So make sure to check the link for the podcast in the podcast and the FAFSA website to contribute today.
Absolutely. So, all right, let's get back to candidates that are beyond the FAFSA PAC level, right? And we've been talking about U.S. Congressman Byron Donalds. Of course, he has been endorsed by the president, and he's been in the news for a couple of things. First, he and his wife, Erica, are pitching a major overhaul to Florida's education system as part of his run for governor. So he was speaking at a Miami-Dade college event, and they called really, for replacing the state school grading system, arguing that the current A to F model doesn't really capture what students really need. Byron Donalds says that schools should still be measured on core academics, but also on practical life skills like managing money and basic home economics.
He's also proposing individualized learning plans for every student. That's something that's new and now is used mainly for students with unique abilities. But now he's proposing we have a more broad view with every student having one of those, and providing more of a stronger emphasis on trades and apprenticeships and as valid post-high school paths for students. So obviously he's got a lot of plans there.
Absolutely. And we know that our state has very much been focused on career and college readiness and workforce development. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. So his wife, Erica Donalds, is no stranger to the state of Florida, of course. She leads several charter school businesses and said that profit shouldn't be a dirty word in education, and that opening the system further to provide private enterprise could drive innovation. Her charter school ties have definitely in the past raised a conflict of interest of questions, but she has defended her work, saying that she should be compensated like everybody else.
The couple's vision that they spoke of this week certainly offers the clearest look yet on how current Congressman Donalds might reshape Florida's education system if he was to be elected governor. And I think as we were talking about building those relationships and talking about with the PAC and what we were discussing earlier, I do think it's important to note he's someone that we connected with, very early on in his time in the Florida House. And it just shows you that you never know where these folks, when you're supporting them, when they are House members, what will happen when they become, either state senators or U.S. senators or, in fact, right now, obviously a U.S. congressman and maybe the next governor. Something else that was interesting in his comments that he mentioned while he was speaking was that he is interested and supports the idea of repealing property taxes, much like Governor DeSantis would like to do. In fact, he said that if the current legislature cannot agree on this, he'll pick up the ball on day one as governor. So that will be interesting to see what happens there as well.
Absolutely. And we will definitely keep listeners informed of what's going on and who's talking about this issue in particular. Let's talk about some local district news. Last week in Hernando County, 29 school resource officers have now been trained to wear body cameras on the job. This training consists of 14 8-hour classes, and the officers returned to their schools with the new technology last week. Sheriff Al Neuenhaus said that the utterly amazing technology will hold both citizens and deputies accountable for their actions.
Well, that is some great proactive news. And also this week, the Education Commissioner announced that the department's new complaint process that they will now have in place, which will allow people to report whether prayer and religious expression aren't being allowed in the state's public schools.
And of course, this is coming up right after the US DOE released guidance on prayer and religious expression, saying that those in public schools can pray, act, and speak according to their faith so long as they respect the rights of others. Moreover, the school can't engage in religious activities as an institution, and it doesn't favor any set of secular or religious beliefs over others.
That's right. The commissioner sent an open letter to parents in Florida on March 17th, saying that the state will continue to safeguard the constitutional protections for voluntary prayer and religious expression in our public schools. People can submit their complaints, if they have them, to flfaith@fldoe.org.
That's right. So, and then here where you and I are in the FAFSA office in Leon County, the school board approved more than $7.8 million in budget cuts last week following lengthy and ongoing discussions at the district office to include consolidation of certain portions at the district level, eliminating staff positions at schools, and reducing arts and athletics funding by 50%. This has been ongoing for a number of districts, of course, we know. But here in Leon County, one positive from this is that the initial budget proposal was to completely get rid of the Leon virtual school. But through this recommendation, it will remain open, and those teachers and students will still be able to connect to the local virtual school.
That's right. And just to note that the athletics, arts and athletics cuts were really, the cut was 50%, but it was $2 that the districts have been providing to each school. So it's not the complete budget for arts and athletics. I just don't want any of our folks to be concerned that was completely cut. This is the districts have decided to support schools by giving some more direct funds for those purchases. Some of the schools I think use them to buy band uniforms or football equipment, things like that. And that's what's going to be cut in half. And we know that a lot of our districts, to your point, across the state are having to make these difficult decisions as money is grown tighter and tighter over the last couple of years. An interesting story came out this week also out of Miami-Dade County, talking about school zone cameras, which they had installed there in late 2024. And since that time, the county has issued hundreds of thousands of automated speeding violations of $100. Of course, that's not a surprise. Miami-Dade is huge, very large population. So we would expect that, they would have more than other areas of the state.
That's right. So here's the surprise, though. It is not just that they've issued all of these tickets. It is also that so many of them have not paid their fine, and therefore their licenses have been suspended. How many suspensions are you wondering? Could come that have not, of all these fines that have not been paid, 34,000. The camera enforcement system, of course, as many of our leaders will know, is active right now and allowed from 30 minutes before the school day all the way through the day until 30 minutes after the school day ends. And a notice of violation for the driver is issued if the vehicle exceeds the posted speed limit by more than 10 miles per hour. So it's not just when the lights are flashing, it's even at 11 o'clock on a school day. And our public service announcement really is, please do not speed in these school zone areas. It is important to protect our children and our staff that are around those buildings. And then, of course, please pay your ticket, too, because driver's licenses getting suspended is also a challenge.
That's exactly right. And I do think there was, perhaps some confusion, I think, statewide about that those violations could occur anytime during the school day. I think a lot of us are used to the more, traditional idea of when those lights are flashing, that's when, you can get a violation and not during the actual school day. But in fact, that is what they're allowed to do. And it certainly seems like they've been successful in catching folks in Miami-Dade. And I imagine it's the same across the state. Also this week, the US DOE and and Treasury announced a new federal student assistance partnership that's aimed at fixing what they call years of mismanagement with the federal student loan system. Right now, the student loan portfolio is nearly $1.7 trillion, with fewer than 40% of borrowers actively repaying and almost a quarter in default. Under this new agreement, the Treasury Department will take over collecting defaulted student loans to help bring borrowers back into repayment, with potential expansion to other loan operations. Administration officials say this move brings financial discipline, protects taxpayers, addresses a system that's grown larger than the nation's credit card and auto debt combined. So we'll have to watch that to be sure.
For sure. That is a lot of money. So here's also another interesting story from last week. The nonprofit Global Research Institute, RAND Corporation, released a study about middle and high school students using AI to help with their homework. It turns out that the percentage of middle schoolers who used AI for homework increased from 30% to 46% between May and December of 2025. And for high schoolers, it jumped from 49% to 63%.
Interesting. And even with those huge jumps in AI usage, the study also found that only 9% of middle schoolers and 7% of high schoolers said their schools actually permit them to use AI for their homework. So that's, of course, another wrinkle in this, is whether or not they're actually allowed to do so.
Yes, right. And, we know that those numbers are probably going to continue to rise, of students, teachers, other administrators leveraging this technology. And of course, lawmakers and school districts are going to try to find ways to regulate it. And we saw some AI language this year, not successful, but we'll see what comes into the next year. And of course, we'll be following that along the way.
Absolutely. On a similar note, let's talk about rulemaking and rule development at the state level, because it's something we've talked a lot about as we've been talking about legislation, because of course we know the legislature passes bills, but then that is not the end of what we see when it comes to actual implementation and how we do the things, how our districts do the things, put into place the things that the legislature passes.
Absolutely. So we frequently mention that the Florida DOE has a lot of rules in development. But what does that really mean? And how many really is a lot? So sometimes we have seen over the last 5 years as many as 60 rules under development. And I would say anything more than 10 is probably a lot. And it's constantly in flux. But let's talk about what rulemaking really means. It is creating, changing, and removing the rule language. And this process is fairly straightforward. The agency, meaning Florida DOE, will put out a rule notice. Hopefully, they will share the rule text with us ahead of time, and us being the general public. They notify the public through online systems that the rule is open for development, collects the public comment, and then, of course, moves forward depending on any input provided, any changes to that language for approval by the State Board of Education.
Absolutely. So in Florida statute, Chapter 120 sets the rules for how agencies must create or update regulations. So the Department of State has the authority from the legislature to adopt additional procedural rules found in Chapter 11 of the Florida Administrative Code to help implement and clarify these requirements.
That's right. And so agencies can adopt rules that directly carry out the powers and duties given to them by law, like what you were saying, where we will see it in the statute. And sometimes in those bills, it will specifically say that the Florida Department of Education is required to do rulemaking, or that they can do rulemaking. They can't really just create rules because it might be helpful, or it might generally relate to the purpose of a statute. But we also know that the Florida Department of Education has more rulemaking authority than any other agency in the state of Florida, due to some changes made a few years back. So it gives the executive branch really a little bit more room to create these rules that ultimately are still additional layers of policy that our district and school level leaders have to then implement.
Absolutely. And you can click on the link in the podcast description to find the resources that are available for this episode. And in the resources, there's a link to what rules are currently under development. And you can bet that there will be more coming based on the bills that were passed during this legislative session. Once they are sent to the governor, and assuming that he signs the bills, then it'll be time for the Department of Education to start that process for many of those pieces of legislation that require additional rules to help clarify the implementation for those pieces of policy.
That's right. And so to that end, as we continue to move through these next few episodes of the Leadership Lounge, we're going to dive in probably more to what those policies and pieces of legislation look like that actually did pass. The nice thing is we only had 16 to 20 education-related bills that are really going to impact our schools and our districts this year, other than the budget. And of course, we know we're still waiting on that. More details to come as the legislature even tries to figure out when they're going to come back and do that. So please stay tuned. Please remember to register for the Discover 26 conference. It is filling up so fast. We can't wait to see you all in person and, of course, give you legislative updates while we're there. We thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lounge podcast presented by the Florida Association of School Administrators. Today's podcast was hosted by Michelle White and Jessica Janasiewicz. The podcast was produced by Jeff Willoughby. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. New episodes are released each Monday. For show topics, suggestions, questions, or comments, please email communications@facet.net. We hope you enjoyed the show.